You can start whenever you're ready.
Okay. Hi, everyone. This is Senator Jason Lewis. Unfortunately, we had to cancel the school funding forum that was planned for March 16th at Wakefield High School. And of course, that was due to concerns about the spread of the coronavirus. So what we're doing instead is I will be taking you through the same presentation that I was planning to give that evening. And if you, after watching this video, if you have further questions or further feedback for us, we would welcome hearing from you. Okay, so this presentation concerns school funding in Massachusetts, the Student Opportunity Act, which is major new education funding reform that passed late last year, and specifically the impact on Wakefield Public Schools. So here's what we're going to cover in this presentation. First, a little background on how the Massachusetts school funding formula works. It's often referred to as Chapter 70. Second, we will look at what the changes that have been as a result of the Student Opportunity Act and what the benefits of the SOA, as we like to call it, will be for all school districts and specifically for Wakefield. Third, we will look in more depth at Wakefield's Chapter 70 funding and how that compares to some surrounding communities. And then again, unfortunately, we won't be able to do a live Q&A as we would have at the forum, but would welcome any follow-up questions that you may have for us. Just to be clear, what this presentation does not cover is any discussion of Wakefield's the town budget or the school budget, that are being developed for the next fiscal year 21, which starts on July 1st of this year. And this presentation also doesn't cover anything related to the ongoing negotiations that between the Wakefield Public Schools and the teachers union over a new teacher contract. So let's start with some background on the Massachusetts school funding formula. Basically, the goal of the formula, which was put in place as part of the 1993 Education Reform Act in Massachusetts, is to ensure that every school district in the Commonwealth is adequately and equitably funded, regardless of a particular community's wealth. And this is all rooted in our state constitution, which is actually the oldest written constitution still in use today anywhere in the world. Our constitution calls on us to cherish public schools and public education. So we have a long-standing commitment in our state to the importance of a high-quality public education for all students. So here's a simple graphic that explains how the school funding formula works. There's basically 3 steps to it. Step 1 is to calculate what's known as the foundation budget. And this is what is considered to be an adequate funding level for each school district. It is based on the enrollment characteristics of that district and demographic characteristics as well. So there is a different foundation budget for every school district in Massachusetts. Step 2 is to then calculate what the local contribution should be, and this is the share of the foundation budget that is expected to be contributed from each city or town's local revenues based upon the relative wealth of the community. So predominantly this comes from local property taxes. And then the third step is to calculate the amount of state Chapter 70 aid, which would be provided annually as part of the state budget to each community, and that basically makes up the difference between the foundation budget and the local contribution. So in the next few slides, we just look at each of these steps a little bit more closely. So here's essentially the calculations, the spreadsheet for the foundation budget. This is for Wakefield, and it's for the fiscal year 20, which is the current fiscal year we're in now. And there is a similar spreadsheet like this for every school district. And by the way, you can go online on the Department of Education's website, and you can see these spreadsheets for yourself, for Wakefield or for any other school district. But basically what the spreadsheet does is for each of the different categories of expenses that every school district incurs, there are rates assessed for different age school children, as you can see, for elementary, middle school, high school. And that determines essentially the base budget. And then on the right side of the spreadsheet, there are what are known as increments added for the number of students that are English learners and the number of students who are low income, because the formula recognizes that there are additional costs associated with providing the services that English learner students need. Those are students who don't speak English as their first language, and also for low-income students who face a number of challenges. So all the way in the bottom right of the slide, you can see what the total amount of foundation budget per pupil is for, in this case, again, the Wakefield Public Schools. And again, that number is going to be somewhat different for each community depending on the specific enrollment characteristics and demographic characteristics of that school district. Okay, so now to the second step, which is how the local contribution is calculated. And here, the formula takes into consideration local property values and local income, and the combination of those calculates something called combined effort yield, or it's also known as the ability to pay. Then the combined effort yield divided by the foundation budget is a simple calculation to come up with the target local share. In other words, the percentage of the foundation budget that a particular municipality is expected to contribute. And as a result of some reforms to the formula made about 10 years ago, a ceiling of 82.5% is applied. So in other words, no community is expected to contribute more than 82.5% of its foundation budget. Or said another way, every community receives at least 17.5% in state Chapter 70 aid, regardless of what the community's combined effort yield may be. So then finally, again, step 3, Chapter 70 aid makes up the difference. And here we just have a variety of different communities with very different demographic characteristics. And you can see in the case of Lawrence, most of the foundation budget is made up of state aid. But on the other end of the spectrum, a more affluent community like Natick, most of the funding for their public schools to cover the foundation budget comes from local resources, and in fact, in this case, it would just be 17.5%, which is that minimum amount that is covered by state aid. So this formula has been in place essentially since 1993. When it was put in place, it was considered quite innovative, and many states around the country followed Massachusetts' leads in implementing similar type formulas to figure out, what the needs of each school district are and how much state aid, school funding aid each district should receive. The problem is that over time, the foundation budget has lagged behind the actual cost growth that our school districts have experienced. And that's been true particularly in a number of areas. And this slide here, which was developed by the Massachusetts Budget and Policy Center, a think tank, shows two of those areas in particular, which is in health insurance for school employees. You can see that what the formula has been calculating, and this is on a statewide basis, versus what the actual health insurance costs are, and this was as of a few years ago, there's over $1 billion gap there. And then another major area where the foundation budget formula has lagged behind the actual costs in the real world is special education, and you can see both in-district special education and out-of-district. Out-of-district is for students who have very severe needs that can't be met within the district and need to be placed in special schools that are appropriate to serve their needs. Anyway, in both of those cases, the foundation budget has not kept up with actual costs. So in response to this, the state legislature back in 2014 created a special commission, and this was actually as a result of legislation that I filed at that time when I was a state representative. That commission was bipartisan. It consisted of all relevant stakeholders who have expertise, when it comes to our schools and school funding. They conducted public hearings around the state, reviewed all kinds of research and data on school funding, and then the report that they issued in 2015 recommended updating the foundation budget in 4 areas. That includes health insurance, which we already talked about on the previous slide, special education, and then 2 other areas are English learners and low-income students. And the Foundation Budget Review Commission said that the current assumptions in the foundation budget formula for how much additional funding English learners and low-income students need understates what school districts actually need to provide those students the quality education that they deserve. So that's sort of the background, how the formula works, the problems with the formula, specifically the foundation budget, and the recommendations of the Foundation Budget Review Commission. So that then brings us up to last year, which was when the legislature drafted and passed, and Governor Baker then signed into law in late November, the Student Opportunity Act. And the Student Opportunity Act, or SOA, is the most significant update to our state's school funding formula in 25 years, since the 1993 law. And it has been hailed as a landmark achievement to help us truly realize the fundamental goal of adequate and equitable funding for every one of our school districts, so that every student, regardless of her zip code, has access to a high-quality school and can realize his or her full potential. So let's take a look at what the Student Opportunity Act does and what the benefits are for all of our school districts, and in particular Wakefield. So first of all, the Student Opportunity Act implements all of the recommendations of the Foundation Budget Review Commission. It updates the way that healthcare costs are calculated so that they will more accurately reflect the actual healthcare costs, and as well as healthcare inflation going forward. The assumptions around special education, both the number of students requiring special education services and the rates, are also updated. Funding for English learners is increased and also differentiated by grade level to reflect that it takes even more resources to educate older students who do not speak, who are not native English speakers. And then the most significant changes made to the foundation budget revolve around how we are now treating low-income students. And as a result of the Student Opportunity Act, the additional funding that districts receive for low-income students is based upon the share of low-income students in each district, with those districts that educate the largest number of low-income students receiving more additional funding, up to what's known as 100% of the base foundation rate. And in addition to updating what are known as the low-income rates, the Student Opportunity Act also updates the methodology for counting the number of low-income students in each district, and puts for the first time into law that all low-income students up to 185% of the federal poverty level should be counted in every district when determining calculating the foundation budget and the number of low-income students who would then qualify for additional funding. The Student Opportunity Act, however, doesn't just stop with The Student Opportunity Act, in addition to a number of very important funding reforms that are made, also does a number of things to, again, further support high-quality education for all students and to help our school districts. We created a new 21st Century Education Fund. It'll be a grant program to provide flexible funding to districts that are pursuing innovative approaches to closing achievement gaps and opportunity gaps for students. And all schools and districts will be able to apply for these grants, although districts that serve the largest numbers of low-income students will get preference. And school districts will have to make publicly available plans for closing achievement gaps within that district, and need to include parents and educators, in those plans. And the idea is that it all will be very transparent to the community, so that each community will know what their school district is doing to improve and whether they are making progress against their goals and metrics, and be able to continue to provide input. We also are going to be, for the first time, broadly collecting and publishing data on student preparedness for post-high school success in college and the workforce, so we really understand what practices in our high schools are most effective in ensuring that students graduate and they are well prepared to succeed after high school. And finally, we are creating a new data advisory commission to really improve how we use data at the state level, the district level, and down to the individual school level, so we understand what strategies are working, how our students are performing, and we can really focus resources where they are most needed. So the Student Opportunity Act is being implemented over a number of years. The foundation budget changes and the increased Chapter 70 aid as a result is going to be phased in over the next 7 years. So starting with the upcoming fiscal year 21 through fiscal year 27. The changes to an increase in charter tuition reimbursements are going to be phased in over the 3 years. The transportation costs are now being reimbursed as part of the special education circuit breaker will be phased in over 4 years. The lifting of the spending cap for the MSBA was effective immediately upon the governor's signature of the Student Opportunity Act late last year. So the bottom line, of all of this is that the state of Massachusetts will be making really historic new investments in our public schools. We estimate that approximately $1.4 billion in new Chapter 70 aid will be provided to our public schools once the legislation is fully implemented. And that's over and above what our school districts would have been receiving just as a result of inflation, increases due to inflation. The majority of that new money will be, by design, going to schools and districts, again, that serve the largest numbers of disadvantaged students, and those are the districts that have faced the greatest challenges in serving their students, and because of a lack of adequate funding. But all districts will benefit from the increases in Chapter 70 aid. Then we estimate about $100 million in new state funding will be provided to our public schools and our communities because of the special education transportation reimbursements and the 21st Century Education Fund. And then we estimate about another $75 million will be provided to our school districts because of the additional charter tuition reimbursements. Okay, so what does this all mean now for the town of Wakefield and Wakefield Public Schools as a result of the passage of the Student Opportunity Act? Well, very good news. Wakefield stands to benefit in four areas from the Student Opportunity Act. First, and perhaps most importantly, because we were able to expand the capacity for the Massachusetts School Building Authority, that was part of the reason that Wakefield High School was just recently accepted into the state's school building program. And so that is very, very good news. and it means that we are now going to be able to move forward with a feasibility study and then the design and the construction of a new Wakefield High School, which is something we know the community has long needed and will be, I think, a wonderful new facility and asset to the students and families of Wakefield. So that's the first significant impact of the Student Opportunity Act on Wakefield. Second is that we will see some modest increases in Chapter 70 aid compared to what the status quo would have been, in other words, if the Student Opportunity Act had not passed. And we will look further in a moment specifically at Chapter 70 aid for Wakefield. Third is that the community we'll be seeing additional and increased special education circuit breaker reimbursements. Again, that's because of now adding transportation costs into the circuit breaker. And also because Wakefield does send some students to mostly the Mystic Valley Charter School in Malden, there will be also increased charter tuition reimbursements that Wakefield will receive. So if you look at this in total, and once all provisions of the Student Opportunity Act are fully implemented in the coming years, we estimate that Wakefield will see increased annual state aid somewhere between $1 million and $1.5 million per year over and above what the town would be receiving if the Student Opportunity Act had not been signed into law. So obviously a significant positive financial benefit for the town as a result of the passage of the Student Opportunity Act. The Student Opportunity Act, last slide here, recognizes that although there are many, many important reforms that are included, there are still other issues that need to be tackled further. And two of these include looking in more depth at the way that the required local contribution in the Chapter 70 formula is calculated, because the Student Opportunity Act really focuses on the foundation budget and not really on the second step in the formula, which is the calculation of how much each municipality needs to contribute. So a new task force is set up by the SOA, led by the State Department of Revenue and the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education. And they are tasked with looking and analyzing how the required local contribution is calculated and making recommendations to improve equity and fairness across different communities. They will also are required to have a public participation process, and we will be providing more information about that shortly to the community. And then secondly, the Student Opportunity Act establishes a Rural Schools Commission, which will be looking at the unique challenges facing rural schools in Massachusetts and schools with declining enrollment. Okay, so to the final part of our agenda, now we're going to look specifically at Wakefield's Chapter 70 funding and a little bit of a comparison with some other communities. I know some numbers have already been circulating in the community, and how we can address concerns about that, about Wakefield's level of funding going forward. Okay. So we are going to look here at Wakefield's Chapter 70 aid compared to some of the surrounding communities. And first, these are the calculations that you may have already seen. This is looking at, for Melrose, Reading, Saugus, and Stoneham, the number of students, the total Chapter 70 aid, and then the per pupil Chapter 70 aid, which is, of course, column 2 divided by column 1. I should just point out that the Chapter 70 numbers here are preliminary for fiscal year 21, which starts July 1st of this year, based on Governor Baker's budget proposal. And these numbers could still change somewhat as the House and Senate debate the fiscal 21 budget later this spring. So what you can see is it certainly does seem unfair that Wakefield is getting a little bit below $2,000 per pupil in Chapter 70 aid, and some of the other surrounding communities that are don't seem all that different from Wakefield, are receiving more closer to $2,400 to $2,600 per student. So now if we look at what the additional columns that have come up on this slide, you can see some of what's driving these differences. And some of this we can explain based on some some reasonable differences between school districts, and some is certainly more difficult to understand and justify. But what you can see is if you look at the low percentage of low-income students, and then the column that includes the percentage of English learner students, you can see, for example, that Saugus certainly has more low-income students and more English learners than does Wakefield. And this is also true for Stoneham. And that is certainly one of the main reasons why, if not the main reason why, you do see Stoneham and Saugus that do receive somewhat higher Chapter 70 aid per pupil than Wakefield does. The next column shows enrollment changes or enrollment growth, in this case, over the last 5 or so fiscal years. And this is very important because the formula is very sensitive to enrollment changes. As enrollment grows, that does drive more Chapter 70 aid. As enrollment is flat to declining, obviously, much less growth in Chapter 70 aid. So you can see here that in the case of Melrose, they've seen some pretty significant growth, and that certainly is one of the main reasons why Melrose has seen a bump up in their total Chapter 70 aid and their Chapter 70 aid per pupil, whereas Wakefield's enrollment has basically been pretty flat, over the last five or 6 years. The next column shows the Chapter 70 as a percent of foundation budget. Now remember, the formula for all of these communities, these are all communities that, based on their local property values and income, are in that category that we talked about earlier, where the maximum amount that they are required to contribute from local resources is 82.5% of the foundation budget. Or said another way, they should be receiving a minimum of 17.5%. And in fact, shouldn't be receiving more than 17.5%. You can see that what's going on is that Wakefield right now is basically at that level. It's at 18%, but obviously close to 17.5%. But the other communities are slightly above that. And Reading is clearly the outlier here, because Reading is actually receiving right now 26% of their foundation budget in Chapter 78. So they are quite a bit above the 17.5% where they're supposed to be. And what's going on here is that Reading is basically benefiting from grandfathering and what's known as hold harmless. Reading's level of Chapter 70 aid has basically been held at a level that it was at many years ago. And what the formula never reduces the Chapter 70 aid for any community. A decision was made a long time ago, and it's actually different than other states. But even when enrollment declines in a district, the Chapter 70 aid is never reduced. It's held communities are held harmless. And in fact, in most years, what is known as minimum aid is provided by the state to school districts, and that's a minimum amount of additional money per pupil. It might be $20, $30, maybe as much as $50. So Reading has benefited from being held harmless to the level of Chapter 78 that they were at many years ago, and then most years still receiving minimum aid. And that is why they are above the level that they're supposed to be, and why they receive more per pupil than Wakefield does. Now, that's clearly would strike many people as unfair, and what the formula is doing to try to correct for that is it is adjusting the changes in aid or growth in aid each year to try to bring communities to the 17.5% where they should be. So if obviously nobody's below 17.5, so if you were, the formula would be bringing the community up to 17.5%. But for communities that are above 17.5%, which would include all of those in this list, and particularly Reading, the formula is gradually bringing those cities and towns down to 17.5 by giving them smaller increments in Chapter 70 aid each year. And typically, again, that may just be minimum aid. So that's what you see in the final column here, which shows the growth in aid over the last 5 fiscal years. And what you see is that Reading has had a very, very small increase in aid, only 7%. And this is not 7% per year, of course. This is 7% total over that 5-year period. So the formula indeed is slowly bringing Reading over time to closer to that 17.5%, although it is happening, quite slowly and gradually. And Wakefield, on the other hand, and Stoneham, which have traditionally been communities that were, getting lower levels of aid, the formula has been bringing them up to where they're supposed to be, and that's why you see Stoneham and Wakefield receiving the largest total increases in Chapter 78 over the last 5 years relative to the other communities. So to sum up, there are some different reasons, why there are these differences. Sargus in particular does have more low-income students and English learners, and that's why they receive more aid. Melrose has seen some significant enrollment growth. That has, pushed up their aid, although again, since they're at 21% of foundation, that is going to they're going to be gradually being brought back down to 17.5 through smaller increases in the future. But there clearly is a discrepancy between when you compare Reading to Wakefield, and that certainly isn't fair, and that does reflect again that Reading has been held harmless, and that's why they are receiving that level of aid. So let's now look at what we can expect going forward as a result of the Student Opportunity Act on Wakefield's foundation budget and Chapter 78. And in this slide, what we've done is make some assumptions about what's going to happen to enrollment going forward and inflation. So these are projections. They should certainly not be used for any budgeting purposes, within Wakefield. But what you see is that as a result of the Student Opportunity Act and changes to the foundation budget, healthcare, special education, low-income students, English learners, we expect that the foundation budget per pupil will be rising from around $11,000 where it is now, all the way up to close to $14,000 per student by fiscal year 27. And what we project that means for Chapter 70 aid is that it will be rising from where it is today, and will likely be closer to $2,500 per student by fiscal year 27. So we do see a fairly good growth that we project to happen in Chapter 70 aid, again in total and per pupil, as a result of the full implementation of the Student Opportunity Act over the next coming years. So next steps. What I would suggest is that we, in the Wakefield School Committee and others who are interested in these issues of school funding and how do we ensure adequate and equitable school funding for all districts, that we submit feedback to the special task force that I mentioned before has been created by the Student Opportunity Act. It's being led by the Department of Revenue, working with the Department of Education, and they are tasked with looking closely at the part of the formula that determines local contributions and various issues related to that, and potentially recommending further reforms to the Chapter 70 formula, because this could certainly be an area where changes are considered that that could be of benefit to Wakefield and other similarly situated communities. And then the second suggested next step, I think, is to continue to discuss other ways that the state can support Wakefield Public Schools. That may be through the Chapter 70 formula, or that may be through other areas, just like the Student Opportunity Act made changes to the circuit breaker, to charter reimbursement, and of course to the capacity of the MSBA, and that's of great benefit to the town of Wakefield and Wakefield Public Schools. So thank you very much for following along with this presentation. And again, apologies that we weren't able to do this in person and that I wasn't able to answer your questions and hear your direct feedback at the forum that we were looking forward to holding on March 16th. But hopefully this was helpful in better understanding the school funding formula and what it means specifically for Wakefield as a result of the passage of the Landmark Student Opportunity Act. And again, please feel free to reach us by phone or email or on social media to continue the discussion, ask further questions, and to provide additional feedback. Thank you very much.